Welcome to the Hello FirstName podcast. The Hello FirstName podcast revolves around the term personalization and is brought to you by marketing author Rasmus Holing, founder of Omnichannel Institute and Chief Experience Officer at the marketing automation software company Agilic. The podcast is based on the book Hello FirstName. Each episode is based in turn on a chapter from the book, followed by a discussion of the very same chapter with an expert marketing practitioner in the following episode. As always, you can buy the book on Amazon or other bookstores. You can also choose to listen to it all for free on your favorite podcast service. You're also very welcome to download the abstract of the book for free, and all models, of course, are able to download. All downloads are sponsored by Agilic. I'll make sure to put a link to everything in the show notes. But you can always connect on LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to reply and help out. Hello, and welcome to the Hello FirstName podcast/webinar. Today we're going to be discussing chapter number 4 with Matt Johnson. Matt Johnson, welcome to the show. I'm so happy that you took the time.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to chatting.
And I was actually in the practicing or the rehearsal or the research for this particular recording. I was trying to decide how I should introduce you, but really you are wow. You have quite an extensive resume. I mean, from Palo Alto to Shanghai, PhD from Princeton, TEDx, author of several books. And so I decided that maybe I would throw that bone over to you, and maybe in your own words, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure, happy to. So originally I'm from Northern California and grew up about an hour north of the San Francisco area. I've always been just fundamentally fascinated with other people. So people, I think, are just these endlessly fascinating creatures, individuals as separate entities, individuals in groups, collective societies, really at any level of social organization. I think people are fascinating. So there was sort of no mystery that I became a psych major and then a neuroscience major. And then right after my undergraduate, I went and pursued a PhD in neuroscience. So my doctorate was focused on sort of the neuroscience of perception and communication. So essentially how we go from the raw sensory signals in our environment, the sights and sounds, and the tactile sensations that we receive, how we interpret these, how we build these rich inner landscapes that really only we can experience, but then ultimately how we're able to communicate these ideas and these concepts in the social environment. So that was my PhD focus, and then after that I went into the business world. And to be totally frank, I thought this was going to be just a reaction move. I thought this was the break I needed from being in school for so long. I was in like the 28th grade essentially at that point. Yeah, exactly. Sort of get back in touch with the common man, and sort of ironically, it was that sort of dipping my toe into the business world that sort of led me to this rich connection between neuroscience and business, and particularly neuroscience and marketing. And
so that's to jump all in. Yeah, that's fascinating. Neuroscience, it sounds I don't know, maybe even a bit sci-fi to me. Neuroscience, I have this vague idea of what it is, but can you fill me in a bit on that? Psychology, I think I've got that nailed down. I'm from a family of psychologists, but neuroscience, what on earth is that? If you have to put in layman's terms.
So yeah, I think neuroscience spans many different fields. So you can study the brain just as a physical system. You can get into the organic chemistry of the brain. You can get into sort of the nitty-gritty details of synapses and neurochemicals and neurotransmitters. I study neuroscience at a more systems level, which is trying to understand psychological mental processes at the level of their neural mechanisms. So if you look at something like learning or memory or emotional processing or jealousy, ultimately, if we understand the brain to be sort of the underlying biology, which allows us to have all these mental faculties, there's sometimes distinct mechanisms, distinct substrates, which allow for these processes to unfold. And so for me as a neuroscience, that's my level of focus, really understanding psychology at the level of neural processes.
And that then goes into marketing and how we make decisions, I assume. And how did you get into sort of the marketing application of psychology and neuroscience then?
So that was really my big focus as I began to really explore this exploration, was ultimately this realization that marketers and neuroscientists are interested fundamentally in the same questions. As sort of strange as that marriage sounds, that they're really more similar than I think we realize. So the fundamental question which both are trying to answer is really trying to understand and predict human behavior. Neuroscience is really attempting to do this more from of course, scientific standpoint, that the pursuit there, the North Star, is truth. However myopic, however nuanced, you're aiming to get a better understanding of how the brain works and how the brain responds to its environment. In marketing, the same fundamental question is there. You're trying to understand and predict human behavior, but now the North Star is not truth per se, but you want to have enough understanding such that you can have a course of action. Really, the North Star there is practical in nature. And so
motivate or nudge some kind of decision to happen earlier.
Exactly. So yeah, different orientations, different goals, but really a lot of convergence in terms of the same basic questions they're attempting to answer.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So at least I found it important to cover in doing the book Hello FirstName that this podcast is built on. I found it intriguing to at least scratch the surface in terms of why does personalization even work. And so that was the idea, and thank you so much for coming. I think you have a great deal to contribute here. You also have multiple books behind you. But first of all, I think I would like to ask you from your kind of so one of the earlier chapters was really about the definition of personalization, which I mean we can go on about for hours, and indeed I kind of already did with other people though. And so I've been visiting other PhDs that actually did PhD specifically in personalization, and we were discussing about the definition of personalization and such. And I think what we came to in terms of a conclusion was that there are many different perceptions of this. So before we start getting too deep into this, I think I'd like to hear sort of what is your perception of what personalization is. I hope that's a fair question.
Totally fair question. Yeah, so I think I would sort of define it as a spectrum. So you can imagine at one end of the spectrum, all customers in all regions in the total addressable market essentially have the same generic experience. And they have the same generic experience really at every level of the customer journey. So in the email copy, they literally get an email, which would be very counter to the title of your book, saying, hello customer or dear customer. And everybody gets that same experience. They get the same product. They get the same everything along the customer journey. And then you imagine if you move more in the direction of a personalized experience, every customer now has an experience at every level of the customer journey, which is catered and tailored towards their pre-existing preferences, or at least the perception on behalf of the brand of what they understand to be these prepotent preferences. And so at a very simple level, this is, hello Rasmus instead of hello customer. In terms of the content of the email, this is potentially, personalized based on even grammatical preferences or linguistic preferences in terms of the types of emails that they get. And we're just talking about email here, but this is potentially any aspect of the customer journey and any window into the brand. There's an element of this personalization. So you imagine like
could be advertising, could be voice, or the treatment you get on the call center, or
Absolutely. Yeah. So in paid advertising, of course, it's a really big question of just how much you should hyper-personalize a targeted ad, because, of course, you can get very detailed demographic, even psychographic information. You can get, an individual advertisement that shows up on your Instagram, which is tailored to like you and maybe 5 other people. I mean, you can get to the level of granularity where it's targeting,
one.
Exactly. So you can get very, very personalized there. So yeah, I sort of see it as a spectrum from generic to sort of hyper-personalized down to sort of the individual level of granularity.
We were even discussing the case where you choose to exclude someone from a specific type of communication. That's also actually an act of personalization. One that the recipient that would thus not get the communication would obviously never realize that they were part of the segment that was excluded. But even that is a unique customer experience, or one that is different from what you'd be giving the large masses. So even excluding people could even be an act of personalization. So relating to music, where we say that the breaks in music are actually also part of the music. So maybe the same is true for marketing or customer communication in general.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I would, just to add to that, I mean, I think just how a brand decides to communicate with an individual consumer is an act of personalization. So, they may surmise based on the demographic information that they have that they don't answer emails, and that, classic snail mail or flyers is the best way to reach that individual consumer. And so, or no communication at all. That, they don't need communication, or, they it's not going to
unlock. Sleeping dog lie and such.
Absolutely. So, marketing communications, I think, at every level can be personalized.
So in the book, and in the chapter about how why personalization works, I discovered this theory about the fundamental motives framework, which sort of sits on top of the Maslow pyramid of needs. And I came across some thinkers and some academics who were sort of relating any marketing message and the reason that it works back to some kind of deeper need, the fundamental motive that we have as human beings. And then that could be like finding a mate, or staying out of harm's way, or not getting ill, or it could be looking after your children, and so on. And any of these motives could then be active at any given point in time for any different individual. So, I mean, if I'm at the club and I'm single, I would have one kind of motive, most likely. Whereas if I'm at home taking care and talking in my daughter, that's another motive that would thus be active, even though I'm the same person. So that was sort of how I tried explaining why personalization works. If you can find out what is now currently active with, or most likely active with, one particular recipient, and you can stress that and tone that up, and you can align your communication with that motive, then you'd be off to making people, nudge people to make that decision they would maybe have done otherwise, but they make it earlier, or they make it instead of almost making it, or they buy more, or they buy earlier, or whatever. But from your sort of neuroscience background, what would your explanation be as to why personalization works in the first place?
I think we can look at it from a couple different angles. I mean, I do think the social element that you've indicated with Maslow and his contemporary Leon Festinger, we have this sort of fundamental social drive to be understood, to feel valued by our social group. And one of the ways in which we establish this sort of sense of felt value is feeling as if our interlocutors know us. And, of course, a signal that they know us is that they have come to understand our preferences. They know our name. They address us in the ways that we prefer. And so I think just there's a sense of warmth that we get from these types of these types of interactions. So I think there's definitely the social element of it. There's also good evidence at sort of a different level in terms of our basic attention. So I'm not sure if you dove into this in the book, but there is this cocktail party effect, which is a fairly robust.
Came across that.
Which is a fairly robust sort of attentional phenomena. So it's named the cocktail party effect because, of course, you're in a cocktail party and you're thoroughly engaged in this conversation just with this person right across from you, and you're talking about something totally, unrelated. And then you hear sort of in the background your name. You hear Rasmus, and you weren't paying attention to that conversation. Yeah, you weren't eavesdropping, but now your attention is exogenously driven towards this other conversation. And so there's this indication that we have this sort of baseline level of attentional bandwidth, which is always on reserve for what Baddeley called this sort of highly salient items, our names being sort of one of them. There was a recent replication of this, not in the auditory domain, but in the visual domain, which is really interesting, that as we're sort of scanning through images and we're just in this very low attentional state scrolling through Instagram, but if you see a picture of your own face, it's a bit like the cocktail party effect, where that is now going to trigger this sort of reserve of attention that wasn't even on at the moment of the moment right before you saw that. And so this has led to a different type of personalization in terms of sort of face-based personalization, where data about individual faces are marketed back to those customers because it is sort of highly prioritized in terms of their attentional.
So what they're trying to display images in front of people that look similar to the actual people?
Yeah, or in many cases are their own faces, and they're sort of put onto a.
Wow.
So you imagine an ad, for example, for I don't know, some Nike shoes, and instead of a generic model wearing these shoes, it's literally your face and maybe even your body, but are wearing the shoes. So it's sort of superimposed with AI.
My body, but slightly fitter.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow, that's okay. I actually had parked this topic for later, but I cannot not talk about creepiness right now. So can you tell us a bit about sort of your view on creepiness? When do you get over that thin line where things become creepy instead of personal?
So I think there's sort of a different threshold for different people. I think modern consumers of digital media, I think, have a baseline level of understanding, especially in the U.S. I know that Europe is a little bit stricter about these things with GDPR.
I'd be totally freaked out by my face on an ad. Really.
Oh, totally. So yeah, I think the median American consumer is I think accepting tacitly with a certain level of personalization, which comes from data. They know that every time they log into either Android or go on Chrome, there's cookies tracking you and this and that, and you go into a different site and you see the same ads, and people get it at this point, going on 5-10 years of this type of data tracking. So I think there's sort of a tacit level of understanding. I think it's when this data gets sort of funneled into a broader attempt to personalize, where they really see the full extent of it. And you see across potentially different websites, different information being pulled and synthesized in a message that could only be created if this data was drawn from these different sources outside the awareness of the consumer. So I think at that point it begins, at least to the median American consumer, to start feeling a bit creepy. Yeah.
So I found that, especially on advertising, there's very little you can do in terms of explicit personalization. So if you're showing it to, if it's too obvious that you're personalizing something particularly for me, and you're showing it to me in the ad while you're showing it to me, then for a lot of people that will be freaking them out. So that has to be a bit more. So I distinguish between explicit personalization, where it's visible for the end customer that they are being personalized towards, versus implicit personalization, where it's more subtle and it could be a coincidence. So it's okay. At least that's my sort of working theory, that it's more okay to do the explicit personalization on owned media such as email, or even on the website if you're logged in. So you can call me out by name, you can show me my previous orders, you can show me what I just looked at, and I'm realizing that's okay because we're just right here, whereas an ad is something that is out there, and I'm having this idea that other people could potentially be seeing this as well, whereas the intimacy of my mailbox is something that I know belongs to me, and it's not that dangerous.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. I think as well that there's a lot of evidence to indicate that consumers tend to think sort of very utilitarian about these things, and that they really care about sort of the end goal of this data collection and this synthesis. So I think there's some brands that are collecting massive amounts of data. They're hyper-personalizing experiences, but it's understood from the consumer that this is not done in an attempt to sell them things that they didn't know that they wanted, and to hyper-personalize and to sell their data to third parties, but it's done to enhance their experience with the brand. So I think Spotify is the perfect example. They collect a ton of data from consumers, and they are ultimately utilizing this in large part to personalize the experience to augment the value of the platform for the consumer. And I think Spotify Wrapped is the sort of the best example of a campaign that showcases that. I mean, all other digitally native brands are trying to hide the fact that they're collecting data and personalizing the experience, and it's a downside that no user gets the same experience on Amazon, on Facebook, on Instagram, etc. Everyone gets a very different experience on Spotify, but on Spotify they created a brand and they created a creative execution that really celebrates the fact that we're all different, and we all know that you're different because of your listening patterns and this and that, and we're
show it,
absolutely. So they've showcased this as a positive. So I also think the end goal and what's communicated as the end goal to the consumer also makes a big difference in terms of this creepiness factor.
Totally, and I even think there's an upsell opportunity in the Spotify Wrapped, because it's very clear for non-family account holders that once your toddlers start listening in on kiddies music on the Spotify, that suddenly becomes part of your yearly rundown, and it's that's a clear indication that you'll be needing an upgrading to a family account. Yeah. So we'll be talking a lot about, or at least we'll be covering a bit later. I'll be asking you about how personalization can affect the brand, and I do think Spotify is a brilliant example of that because they took it in. But let's park that for a moment here. So there's this thing about there's a lot of talk in Europe, at least right now, about consent and have you given marketing consent, and have you given as a consumer the consent to your data being used here and there. But what I've seen, at least, and me and the co-authors have experienced, is that there's one thing is sort of having the legal consent for capturing data and personalizing content and such, but there's also the thing about having an emotional consent. And really coming back to the creepiness aspects, that you may have sort of secured the consent legally in the bottom of page X in your terms and conditions, and so you may not be sued, but you can, if you don't have the emotional consent, and if the consumer isn't aware that you are collecting this data, then using that for explicit personalization can become super creepy because you're overstepping the boundaries of the emotional consent. Maybe does that fit with your sort of description or understanding of the creepiness border?
That really resonates. There was I don't know if you saw this, but there was an artist in Brooklyn a few years ago that had an exhibit that they called Terms and Conditions. And what they did is they printed out of some of the biggest tech companies, like the terms and conditions, fully out. Yeah, in just regular times 12, Times Roman font. And these things were 18 pages long. And it was to sort of showcase the fact that, technically, legally, when you click that, small button, that is the difference between you logging onto your account and not. You're signing all these things away, and you're consenting in a very legal definition of the term. But can does the median, American consumer or Danish consumer have the, legal ability or the cognitive wherewithal to fully evaluate, to fully evaluate, what they are signing up for? And I think that the bigger issue as well is that we live in a world, in a consumer world, which there's very low substitutability between these two platforms. So when all of your friends got on Amazon, or when you're a small business owner and you need to sell on Amazon, or you need to sell on Walmart, or you need to advertise your company on Instagram, and maybe you have ethical qualms about the type of data that's collected. What business owner in the universe can afford not to have a free Instagram account and to showcase their products and services there? And so there's not really an alternative that is going to treat their data differently. So even if they are going to go through, all this legalese and pick and choose and this and that, there's such low substitutability that they're implicitly coerced, I think, into signing on to a service that goes against their ethical beliefs. So I think strictly from a so I think strictly from sort of a legal standpoint, it's there. But practically speaking, emotionally speaking, I don't think they really have people's full consent. No.
All right, let's move on a bit. So you and I actually recently attended the same conference in Sweden, the Dialogue conference. And in your presentation, you were talking about personalization and personalization within within customer experience. And within that, you're also touching upon the concept of serendipity. Can you just explain to me and the audience a bit how that relates to personalization and sort of what your thoughts are around that?
One of the big ideas from the talk is that personalization, and maybe we'll get into this, personalization I think does have an upper bound. That of course we do like emails that have our first name in them. We do like some degree of personalization. But what if we take this idea to its logical conclusion? We give consumers exactly what they think they want, really at every level of granularity. And where does that leave us? And there's some interesting ideas to indicate that what we ultimately want when we can have anything are things that we can't predict and can't expect, and that our pre-existing preferences that could potentially be measured and captured can't ultimately be synthesized to predict a future response, because ultimately what we want is something that violates existing expectations. And so that the talk really focused on this. Absolutely. So there was two prescriptions at the talk, or at least two sort of things that I would consider worthwhile for marketing managers to consider. One is sprinkling in a bit of unpredictability into the customer journey, sort of knowing generally what consumers want, and then delivering something within that range of likability, something that they couldn't have predicted ahead of time.
So what could that be, for instance?
Sure. So there's a couple examples in the talk I gave. Pret a Manger, for example, has this great sort of practice where they give every consumer, or every barista rather, what's called the Random Acts of Kindness Fund. And so they can just comp any patron's order, just because they had a feeling about them. And so from the perspective of the consumer, they're fully expecting to pay for this $5 coffee. They go up to the counter, and it comes as a surprise. And so you contrast that with what typically happens, which is you have a loyalty card, you punch 10 coffees, and you're going to get your 11th one free. You go to the store, you get that free coffee, it's fine. But free coffee by surprise, I think is going to galvanize that pleasure response. And there is some
kind of already factor that into your experience, that I am going to get coffee number 10. So what if I get number 5 and I didn't think about it? Then suddenly that's unexpected, and it's a fantastic experience.
Absolutely. And we've been studying this at the level of neuroscience for decades now. This is a very sort of well understood response called the prediction error, where we tend to enjoy experiences which are sort of in line with expectations, but we enjoy much more experiences which positively violate our expectations. This leads to this sort of surge of a dopaminergic response sort of deep in the brain, a region called the nucleus accumbens, which is essentially tantamount to our brain's pleasure center. And the nucleus accumbens is really most tantalized by these sort of positive violations of expectations. So it's of course worth noting that surprise across the board, isn't a guarantor of positivity. Of course, I could you stop someone in the street and you insult them and they weren't expecting that. That's a surprise, but that's not going to brighten anyone's day. So it has to be a pleasureful response. It has to be positively surprising. So that seems to be something that is worth testing, at least within a customer journey.
Yeah, and when do you think people or companies should start with sort of the more surprisingly seemingly random acts of kindness? Because we're discussing this from a perspective where people had already hit the glass ceiling of personalization. So they're already, there was an upper level to upper limit for the personalization efforts, and they already hit that. And then sort of next level would be doing the serendipity thing, but in reality, and at least the companies that I talk to and that I interview also for the book here and for the podcast, they may be doing good, they may be doing well, but they're no near any glass ceiling of how much they could personalize. So, are we there yet? Should people sort of do more personalization until they get closer to that glass ceiling, or should they start? When should they start throwing this serendipity, random act of kindness thing into the loop?
I think it really depends on the brand. It really depends mostly on the consumer. So there's some good research now that as a general phenomena, we do like these pleasurable surprises. We do feel senses of connection towards brands and products that provide these serendipitous moments, but there's a lot of individual differences. There's a lot of demographic differences. So the biggest one to pull out is of course loss aversion. So people that are very sort of risk averse, that are a bit more conservative, tend not to enjoy surprises. They just want what they want, and that's fine. And of course, this is going to differ, by industries. If you look at, banks or insurance companies, these are, very conservative institutions. They tend to be highly regulated, and consumers come to expect a certain level of service from their bank. They don't want their bank necessarily to dip into surprise and serendipity and all of these things. They just want their bank to give them, absolutely. Though I should say as well that there is some evidence in behavioral finance that having savings accounts that do have a very low chance of a high yield are actually preferred to a stable but moderate yield. So if you give people the option, hey, do you want a guaranteed,
like lottery?
Yeah, sort of a lottery effect. So if you prefer a guaranteed, 2.5%, savings yield, or do you want a 0.01% chance of, $10,000 being deposited into your account? People do prefer this sort of lottery because they tend to discount these low savings rates anyway. So there's some exceptions there, but there is evidence to suggest that in certain industries, people do just want what they want, essentially.
For the optimal customer experience, would you then advise to do fewer and bigger surprises, or sprinkle it a lot of smaller surprises out over the customer journey?
It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably worth zooming out a bit as well, because I think different brands are going to have different orientations to this.
Sure.
So that I think the biggest sort of perspective there is looking at their market orientation. Are they a market driving force? Are they sort of moving the industry? Are they telling consumers this is what you should value? Are you a luxury brand, or are you Apple or Bang & Olufsen? Are you sort of telling consumers this is cool, this is how music should be listened to? Or are you a market-driven force where you're garnering evidence from consumer bases, and then you're giving them what they already want? And if you're a market driven force and you're really responding to the marketplace, you're in this business of really trying to personalize, and you're really in the business of trying to hyper-personalize experiences with pre-existing preferences, not engaging in really too much surprise and serendipity, because that's not the way consumers tend to see you. They want you to, give them what they already want. If you're Temu, if you're Walmart, if you're Nissan, you're giving the market what they already want. Yeah, exactly. And so if you are, again, sort of a market driving force, I think you do have a lot more leeway and leverage, and there's more expectation on behalf of your consumers in terms of your brand position of, how much you're going to put forward into the market, which they didn't expect, which they didn't ostensibly, explicitly want. So I think in that instance, you have much more leeway to deliver these sorts of surprises and these sorts of serendipitous experiences through the lens of this market driving brand.
So what I didn't know I wanted, but now I know, and I truly want it now. And that makes sense. Talking about branding, we're getting back to that. So your latest book is called Branding That Means Business. And it's had outstanding reviews, by the way. And that leads me back to the sort of the topic that we briefly touched upon earlier with Spotify. And how do you see the relationship between branding and personalization? Can personalization affect brand perception, or even the core brand? How do you see that?
I think it certainly can. I think personalization, the way I've come to think about it, and maybe we'll disagree a bit here, is that personalization is really a tactic. So it's ultimately downstream from the brand strategy.
Yeah.
So
I think that would be the general sort of perception out there.
Okay, got it. Yeah. So that's really the way that I've come to think about it. So the brand strategy is sort of driving, how the brand interacts with customers in terms of the 4 Ps, in terms of specific ways in which emails are written, et cetera, et cetera. I think brands can adopt personalization a bit more upstream at the level of the brand strategy. So I think, again, as we spoke about, if you're a market-driven brand, you necessarily need to personalize, I think, because that's really the expectation. If you're market-driven, I think you're in less of a position necessarily to need to personalize everything. You're certainly not personalizing products, the most direct vessel of value. You might personalize your marketing communications to the preferences of consumers, to the name, et cetera, but you're not giving consumers what they already wanted at a product level per se.
Yeah.
So I think ultimately the decision of whether to personalize, how much to personalize, is decided a bit more upstream at the level of the brand strategy.
Yeah, so I think we have examples of actually both. I've found that at least like companies within luxury, high-end luxury, they tend to not personalize. They almost seem to talk about themselves and their products and how fantastic they are. And if you don't get it, then there's obviously something wrong with you, because they're like this perfect trend-setting company designing the perfect bag or whatever. And that almost reflects in a self-segmentation of the people that subscribe to that belief and say, yes, I am the whatever Chanel woman that you want me to be, and I'll pay an insanely amount of money for the perfect bag, because that will enforce who I am and who I want to be as an individual, going back to the fundamental motives. So they tend to, in my opinion, not personalize as much. I do believe, however, that they could benefit from a maybe more like clienteling way of personalization. So it would be your local, the local person in the store with whom you have a trusted relationship, where you could personify the communication, even from a scalable point of view. But it would seem as if this particular if an email or recommendation would be coming from that particular individual that you know, and you could start a personal conversation from there, answering directly, replying to the email or whatever. But still, the tendency is that the more high-end luxury or brand-oriented communication is, the less it's personalized. So are they just opposed? Because I also see the opposite examples. So it's hard to imagine Amazon without personalization. It's hard to imagine, I could to some extent imagine Spotify without it, and I believe that's how they started also. I mean, just by being able to actually deliver all these tunes to you at a flat fee, that's a fantastic value proposition. But the amount or the degree to which I enjoy the fact that I can take one particular tune and I can start a radio from there on, and it will generally be a good radio station that will be only for me based on what I've liked and the tune that sort of kicks it off and my yearly rundown and whatever. I genuinely come to appreciate the personalization within the platform. I think for Netflix and HBO as well, I think it would be hard to think about these platforms without personalization. So for them at least, it seems as if personalization is a very core part of their value proposition.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think in any dual-sided marketplace, personalization is going to be, really important. So yeah, Amazon, if you're in ride-sharing services, Uber, Easy Drive, like these are very important, I think, to personalize, because this is essentially a marketplace that you're tapping into as a consumer. Any digital platform that at a product level has just a huge corpus of potential media. So Netflix, for example, they have as deep as the Mariana Trench worth of potential content for you. And so how do they know what to serve you? That's going to be based on your viewing preferences. That's going to be based on your demographics. That's going to be based on all of this. Absolutely. So it completely makes sense to want to try and personalize those experiences. And then I think, what you mentioned in luxury brands, makes a ton of sense. And I think, the counter to that would be sort of the market driving forces within media, which would be an HBO, for example, which releases much less, has less inventory, has less media, and is not necessarily in the business of serving existing consumers what they already want, but in the business of saying, we're HBO, we know media, we know movies, we know production, here's Succession, here's Game of Thrones, here's Sopranos. Nobody asked for long form storytelling, but you got Tony Soprano. Yeah, exactly. So I think there's a bit of that really in every industry. Going back
maybe
to
even in every company, because I find that a lot of companies actually doing both, and I believe they should. So there's a time and place for everything. So you'll be having sort of one track of your communication, which is really about getting your brand story out there. And the brand story doesn't necessarily have to be about the consumer. The brand story can be about the brand. And there should be a place for talking about like your unique selling propositions and what you stand for and how you want to change this world and your purpose and whatnot. And that doesn't have to be around the end customer. But then on the other hand, you should be doing also a bit more tactical the campaigns, the seasonal campaigns, the Black Friday, the Black Week, the Christmas sales, the back from school and whatever, as well as the automation part, where you are indeed triggering certain communication to individuals depending on data that is totally individual for them. And so I think they can coexist, and that you could and should do both the branding and the core branding and the big stories, but also while you can do the personalization on the side.
Totally. Yeah, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I mean, when we first started speaking, we talked about sort of defining personalization and this idea of a spectrum, between a generic experience for all and a hyper personalized, highly granularized experience for every individual consumer. And there's a range of possibilities in between that different brands can adopt. I do think that ultimately, if a brand is only sort of dedicated themselves on the personalization front, that's fine, but that's going to be exhausting, and that may not work in the long term because none of that scales, and you're just competing on a tactical level. And if you're just competing on a tactical level, there's nothing really for you to rest your laurels on, and there's nothing enduring that's going to differentiate you between another competitor. And really this more enduring differentiator really is the brand. And so I do think there's some degree of dedication that should be delegated towards the brand building efforts as well.
Great. All right, we're drawing towards an end here. So actually, I'd like to ask you one last question, Matt. So like on a personal level, what's your own favorite example of personalization that you've experienced where you were in the receiving end of the personalization?
So it would be it's a really generic answer, ironically, for a question about personalization. But yeah, to me, it's one we spoke about already, which is Spotify Wrapped. I mean, I think that they just knocked this one out of the park. Yeah. Really every digital company they suffer from this real difficulty of not being able to build community because every consumer has a different experience. So if you are Instagram, no two feeds look alike. If you're on TikTok, nobody gets the same videos. If you're on Amazon, nobody gets the same marketplace items. And it's the same for Spotify. But what they've done is they've turned a ostensibly negative part of being a digital company, a digitally native company, and they've really flipped on its head and said, yes, all of you are listening to our different music and to utilizing our platform in different ways. We're collecting data from all of you, and this is usually thought about as a very negative thing, but we're flipping the script and we're putting this towards a positive thing. We're being very transparent about the level of data that we're collecting, and we're showcasing the incredible diversity in our audience and in our market. And I think the creative execution of this idea is also brilliant. I mean, they keep it relatively consistent each year. It's your top 5 podcasts, your top 5 songs, top 5, artists. But, each year there's a new twist on it. So some years it's, you have a color that these songs sort of represent, or your aura, and so there's always something to look forward to every year. You mentioned this before, but there may be some upselling here. So I do have some friends actually that are like, oh, my 4-year-old started telling Alexa what Spotify songs to play, and that's going to ruin my Spotify playlist. So now I have to get a family account so I can have my own distinct, daily discovery, and I have to build up my data for my my Spotify Wrapped coming up in December. So yeah, I think it's really brilliant, and especially in its industry. I mean, it just stands out so much with the degree of personalization and how they've really positioned this campaign.
Yeah, I think it's probably the subscription that I would be least likely to cancel, because I cannot imagine, throwing away my playlists, and even if I could, I would get lynched by my children because of the family account. So that's a huge login. All right, Matt, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a huge pleasure discussing this topic with you. And I think for our listeners, this is the end of the episode here. Remember that you can download an abstract of the book, Hello FirstName. I'll make sure to put the link in the show notes. You can also download all the models and the illustrations from the book as you see fit. And remember that you can, of course, subscribe to either the Spotify or the Apple podcast or any podcast feed that this appears in, or you can be looking at the the videos from the webinar discussions that I am having every other week with experts with whom I discuss this, such as Matt here. So thank you very much for listening in, and I hope that you'll continue to follow the series. Thank you.
In our next episode, which is a classic audiobook chapter, we'll listen to Chapter 5, Marketing Without Personalization. Personalization hasn't been around forever, so to get closer to an understanding of what it is, we'll be looking close at how marketing works if we take personalization out of the equation.